Welcome to Night Shift Hauntings. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin.
I've been working emergency medical services for 12 years now, and in that time I've learned to trust our dispatch system completely. The voices that crackle through our radios at 3 in the morning represent a carefully orchestrated network of professionals who coordinate our every movement across the county. That trust made what happened on October 15th all the more unsettling. My partner Jake and I were finishing our dinner break at the 24-hour diner on Route 9 when the call came through. The radio crackled to life with the familiar tone sequence, followed by a voice I didn't recognize.
Unit 17, respond to 1247 Maple Street.
Possible cardiac arrest. Elderly male, unconscious and not breathing. The voice was calm. Professional, exactly what you'd expect from our dispatch center. I keyed my radio to acknowledge while Jake started the engine. Something felt different about the transmission, though I couldn't place what it was. The audio quality seemed cleaner than usual, without the typical background noise we always heard from the dispatch center. Jake mentioned it too as we pulled onto Maple Street. New equipment, maybe, he suggested, but we both knew the county budget hadn't allowed for upgrades in years. We found 1247 Maple Street without difficulty. The address was clearly marked, the mailbox still standing at the curb. But where the house should have been, we found only a concrete foundation and a pile of debris that had been there for quite some time. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and the lot had the settled appearance of abandonment. Jake radioed dispatch for clarification while I walked the perimeter of the foundation. The response was immediate but confusing. The dispatcher, using the same unfamiliar voice, confirmed the address and repeated the nature of the call. Elderly male, unconscious, not breathing. When Jake explained that no structure existed at the location, there was a pause before the voice responded. Unit 17. Please confirm you are at 1247 Maple Street. We confirmed our location twice. I was examining the foundation when I noticed the tire tracks. They formed a perfect circle in the dirt lot, as if a vehicle had driven in endless loops around the perimeter of where the house once stood. The tracks were fresh, the tread patterns still clearly defined in the soft earth. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old, yet the lot showed no other signs of recent activity. We radioed our supervisor, requesting permission to clear the call as unfounded. The response came not from our supervisor, but from the same unfamiliar dispatcher. Unit 17, maintain position. Patient is confirmed at location. Jake and I exchanged glances. In 12 years, I had never heard dispatch override a supervisor's authority on scene assessment. For the next 4 hours until sunrise, our radio continued to receive updates about the call. Vital signs, condition changes, requests for our estimated time of arrival at the hospital. Each transmission came through crystal clear, in that same calm, professional voice that none of our regular dispatchers recognized when we later asked them about it. The updates continued even after we had returned to quarters and logged the incident as a false alarm. The county records department confirmed what the neighbors had told us. The house at 1247 Maple Street had been demolished 3 years earlier following a fire that claimed the life of an elderly resident. Harold Morrison, age 73, had died of smoke inhalation in his bedroom. The demolition had been completed by the county after the family decided not to rebuild. I measured those tire tracks before we left that morning. The circumference was exactly 120 feet, the distance a standard ambulance would travel, making a complete circuit of a typical residential lot. The tracks showed no beginning and no end, just an endless loop that had been driven over and over, pressing deeper into the earth with each pass. The calls stopped at exactly 6:15 a.m., just as the sun crested the horizon. Our radios fell silent except for the normal traffic of the day shift taking over. When I checked with dispatch later, they had no record of any transmissions to Unit 17 during our shift. The computer logs showed we had been available and in service all night. With no calls assigned, I still drive past 1247 Maple Street occasionally, usually on night shifts when calls take me through that part of town. The lot remains empty, the foundation cracking further with each winter freeze. But sometimes, in the early morning hours before dawn, I can see fresh tire tracks in the dirt. They're always the same perfect circle, always the same depth. as if someone is still responding to a call that officially never existed. The incident report I filed that night was the only documentation of what happened. 3 pages of detailed observations that our administration filed away without comment. I learned later that Jake had requested a transfer to day shift the following week. He never mentioned the call again, but I noticed he always turned his radio volume down when we drove past Maple Street. What troubles me most isn't the impossibility of what we experienced, but how naturally it fit into our routine. We responded, we assessed, we reported. The system worked exactly as designed, even when the system itself seemed to be responding to something that couldn't exist. It makes me wonder how many other calls we've answered that exist only in the spaces between what we can verify and what we can't ignore. Sometimes the most unsettling part of this job isn't what we find at our destinations, but realizing that something, somewhere, is always watching our every movement and waiting for the right moment to guide us where we're truly needed. Training mannequins are unsettling by design, but after 15 years in emergency medical services, I had grown accustomed to their blank stares and lifeless expressions. Our station housed 6 of them in the training bay, each one a faithful reproduction of human anatomy, designed to help us maintain our skills during the quiet hours between calls. What I experienced during the night of November 3rd challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between training and reality. Partner Sarah and I were scheduled for a 12-hour night shift, and the evening had been unusually quiet. By 2 a.m. we had responded to only one call, a minor fender bender with no injuries. Department policy required us to complete continuing education hours during downtime, so we decided to run through some advanced cardiac life support scenarios in the training bay. The bay was located in the basement of our station, a windowless room with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the rows of mannequins. Each training dummy was positioned on a separate gurney, their plastic faces turned toward the ceiling in permanent expressions of neutral calm. We had used these particular mannequins for 3 years, and I knew each of their minor imperfections: the small chip in the nose of Unit 3, the slightly discolored chest of Unit 5. Sarah selected Unit 2 for our scenario, a standard adult male mannequin that we typically used for intubation practice. I gathered the necessary equipment while she reviewed the cardiac arrest protocol on her tablet. The mannequin lay motionless as we positioned ourselves around the gurney, its chest flat and still beneath the simulation monitor leads. 20 minutes into our practice session, I noticed something that made me pause mid-compression. The mannequin's chest was rising and falling in a subtle rhythm that didn't correspond to my compressions. At first, I thought it might be a mechanical response programmed into the newer models, but Unit 2 was an older model without electronic feedback systems. Sarah noticed it too. "Are you seeing that?" she asked, stepping back from the gurney. We both watched as the mannequin's chest continued its gentle rise and fall, approximately 12 breaths per minute, a normal respiratory rate for a resting adult. The movement was barely perceptible, but unmistakably present. I placed my hand on the mannequin's chest to feel for the source of the movement. The plastic was cool beneath my palm, but I could feel the definite expansion and contraction of what should have been a solid, unmoving surface. Sarah checked the connections to our monitoring equipment, thinking perhaps a malfunction in the training simulator was causing some kind of mechanical breathing response. The monitors weren't connected. Unit 2 was lying on the gurney, exactly as we had found it, with no external power source and no mechanical systems that could account for the respiratory motion. Yet the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, as if the mannequin had developed autonomous lung function. Sarah suggested we try a different mannequin, but I was curious about what we were observing. I attached our portable monitor to check for any electrical activity that might explain the phenomenon. What I saw on the screen made both of us step away from the gurney. The monitor was displaying a faint but definite cardiac rhythm, 43 beats per minute, bradycardic but organized. The mannequin was showing vital signs. We stood there for several minutes, watching the monitor trace a weak but consistent heartbeat while the chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. Sarah radioed our supervisor, but the night supervisor was out on a call and wouldn't return for at least an hour. We were alone in the basement training bay with a mannequin that had somehow developed physiological functions. I documented everything with my phone, taking video of the monitor readings and the subtle chest movement. The timestamps would later prove that the vital signs continued for exactly 47 minutes before gradually fading back to the flat lines we expected from inanimate training equipment. During those 47 minutes, we ran through every logical explanation we could imagine. Electromagnetic interference from emergency radio transmissions, somehow creating false readings on our monitor. Structural settling in the building, causing vibrations that simulated breathing. Equipment malfunction that generated phantom signals. None of our theories accounted for the synchronized cardiac and respiratory activity we were observing. The vital signs faded gradually, like watching someone slip into cardiac arrest in slow motion. The heart rate dropped from 43 to 38, then to 26, finally flatline. The breathing became shallower and more irregular before stopping entirely. By 3:15 a.m., Unit 2 had returned to the lifeless state we expected from training equipment. Sarah and I completed our shift without discussing what we had witnessed, but we both avoided the training bay for the rest of the night. When the day shift arrived, we helped with the usual equipment checks and rig inspections before heading home. I mentioned to the day shift supervisor that Unit 2 might need maintenance, suggesting vaguely that we had noticed some irregularities with the chest mechanics. 3 days later, I returned for my next shift and immediately went to check on Unit 2. The mannequin was positioned exactly as we had left it, lying flat on the gurney with its face turned toward the ceiling. But something had changed during my absence. The eyes, which had always been molded closed in all of our training mannequins, were now open. Not just open, but focused. The plastic eyes seemed to track my movement as I approached the gurney, following me with the kind of deliberate attention that should have been impossible for an inanimate object. I called for Sarah to come look, but when she arrived, the eyes had returned to their closed position. I checked the maintenance logs for the training equipment. No work had been performed on any of the mannequins. No repairs, no upgrades, no modifications of any kind. Yet Unit 2 was undeniably different from the mannequin we had practiced on 3 nights earlier. Over the following weeks, other crew members began reporting unusual experiences with the training equipment. Mannequins found in different positions from where they had been left. Monitors showing phantom vital signs during routine equipment checks. The subtle sound of breathing coming from the training bay during quiet hours of the night shift. I started keeping a log of these incidents, documenting the dates, times, and crew members involved. The pattern that emerged was consistent. The anomalies occurred only during overnight hours, always in the training bay, and always involved Unit 2. Whatever had happened during our practice session seemed to have awakened. Something in that particular mannequin that defied every reasonable explanation. The administration eventually replaced all of the training equipment, citing the need for updated models with enhanced simulation capabilities. Unit 2 was removed along with the others, but I often wonder what the disposal company made of a mannequin that occasionally showed vital signs. I suspect they simply processed it as standard medical training equipment, never knowing they were handling something that had somehow developed its own physiological functions. What disturbs me most about the experience isn't the impossibility of what we witnessed, but how closely it resembled the real medical emergencies we respond to every shift. The vital signs were textbook perfect, the respiratory pattern exactly what we would expect from a living patient. It was as if something had been studying our responses, learning to mimic the exact conditions that would trigger our professional instincts. Sometimes I wonder if our training prepared us for more than we realized, and whether the equipment we practice on might be practicing on us in return. Training mannequins are unsettling by design, but after 15 years in emergency medical services, I had grown accustomed to their blank stares and lifeless expressions. Our station housed 6 of them in the training bay, each one a faithful reproduction of human anatomy designed to help us maintain our skills during the quiet hours between calls. What I experienced during the night of November 3rd challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between training and reality. My partner Sarah and I were scheduled for a 12-hour night shift, and the evening had been unusually quiet. By 2 a.m., we had responded to only one call, a minor fender bender with no injuries. Department policy required us to complete continuing education hours during downtime, so we decided to run through some advanced cardiac life support scenarios in the training bay. The bay was located in the basement of our station, a windowless room with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the rows of mannequins. Each training dummy was positioned on a separate gurney, their plastic faces turned toward the ceiling in permanent expressions of neutral calm. We had used these particular mannequins for 3 years, and I knew each of their minor imperfections. The small chip in the nose of Unit 3, the slightly discolored chest of Unit 5. Sarah selected Unit 2 for our scenario, a standard adult male mannequin that we typically used for intubation practice. I gathered the necessary equipment while she reviewed the cardiac arrest protocol on her tablet. The mannequin lay motionless as we positioned ourselves around the gurney, its chest flat and still beneath the simulation monitor leads. 20 minutes into our practice session, I noticed something that made me pause mid-compression. The mannequin's chest was rising and falling in a subtle rhythm that didn't correspond to my compressions. At first, I thought it might be a mechanical response programmed into the newer models, but Unit 2 was an older model without electronic feedback systems. Sarah noticed it too. "Are you seeing that?" she asked, stepping back from the gurney. We both watched as the mannequin's chest continued its gentle rise and fall, approximately 12 breaths per minute, a normal respiratory rate for a resting adult. The movement was barely perceptible, but unmistakably present. I placed my hand on the mannequin's chest to feel for the source of the movement. The plastic was cool beneath my palm, but I could feel the definite expansion and contraction of what should have been a solid, unmoving surface. Sarah checked the connections to our monitoring equipment, thinking perhaps a malfunction in the training simulator was causing some kind of mechanical breathing response. The monitors weren't connected. Unit 2 was lying on the gurney exactly as we had found it, with no external power source and no mechanical systems that could account for the respiratory motion. Yet the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, as if the mannequin had developed autonomous lung function. Sarah suggested we try a different mannequin, but I was curious about what we were observing. I attached our portable monitor to check for any electrical activity that might explain the phenomenon. What I saw on the screen made both of us step away from the gurney. The monitor was displaying a faint but definite cardiac rhythm, 43 beats per minute. Bradycardic but organized. A mannequin was showing vital signs. We stood there for several minutes, watching the monitor trace a weak but consistent heartbeat while the chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. Sarah radioed our supervisor, but the night supervisor was out on a call and wouldn't return for at least an hour. We were alone in the basement training bay with a mannequin that had somehow developed physiological functions. I documented everything with my phone, taking video of the monitor readings and the subtle chest movement. The timestamps would later prove that the vital signs continued for exactly 47 minutes before gradually fading back to the flat lines we expected from inanimate training equipment. During those 47 minutes, we ran through every logical explanation we could imagine. Electromagnetic interference from emergency radio transmissions, somehow creating false readings on our monitor. Structural settling in the building, causing vibrations that simulated breathing. Equipment malfunction that generated phantom signals. None of our theories accounted for the synchronized cardiac and respiratory activity we were observing. The vital signs faded gradually, like watching someone slip into cardiac arrest in slow motion. The heart rate dropped from 43 to 38, then to 26, finally flatline. The breathing became shallower and more irregular before stopping entirely. By 3:15 a.m., Unit 2 had returned to the lifeless state we expected from training equipment. Sarah and I completed our shift without discussing what we had witnessed. But we both avoided the training bay for the rest of the night. When the day shift arrived, we helped with the usual equipment checks and rig inspections before heading home. I mentioned to the day shift supervisor that Unit 2 might need maintenance, suggesting vaguely that we had noticed some irregularities with the chest mechanics. 3 days later, I returned for my next shift and immediately went to check on Unit 2. The mannequin was positioned exactly as we had left it, lying flat on the gurney with its face turned toward the ceiling. But something had changed during my absence. The eyes, which had always been molded closed in all of our training mannequins, were now open. Not just open, but focused. The plastic eyes seemed to track my movement as I approached the gurney, following me with the kind of deliberate attention that should have been impossible for an inanimate object. I called for Sarah to come look, but when she arrived, the eyes had returned to their closed position. I checked the maintenance logs for the training equipment. No work had been performed on any of the mannequins. No repairs, no upgrades, no modifications of any kind. Yet Unit 2 was undeniably different from the mannequin we had practiced on 3 nights earlier. Over the following weeks, other crew members began reporting unusual experiences with the training equipment, mannequins found in different positions from where they had been left. Monitors showing phantom vital signs during routine equipment checks, the subtle sound of breathing coming from the training bay during quiet hours of the night shift. I started keeping a log of these incidents, documenting the dates, times, and crew members involved. The pattern that emerged was consistent. The anomalies occurred only during overnight hours, always in the training bay, and always involved Unit 2. Whatever had happened during our practice session seemed to have awakened. Something in that particular mannequin that defied every reasonable explanation. The administration eventually replaced all of the training equipment, citing the need for updated models with enhanced simulation capabilities. Unit 2 was removed along with the others, but I often wonder what the disposal company made of a mannequin that occasionally showed vital signs. I suspect they simply processed it as standard medical training equipment, never knowing they were handling something that had somehow developed its own physiological functions. What disturbs me most about the experience isn't the impossibility of what we witnessed, but how closely it resembled the real medical emergencies we respond to every shift. The vital signs were textbook perfect, the respiratory pattern exactly what we would expect from a living patient. It was as if something had been studying our responses, learning to mimic the exact conditions that would trigger our professional instincts. Sometimes I wonder if our training prepared us for more than we realized, and whether the equipment we practice on might be practicing on us in return. St. Matthew's Regional Medical Center had been our primary destination for psychiatric transport since I started working emergency medical services 9 years ago. The hospital's behavioral health wing was located on the 4th floor, accessible only through secure elevators that required staff key cards. I had made dozens of trips to that floor, transporting patients between facilities or responding to medical emergencies within the psychiatric unit. What I discovered during the transport request on January 12th made me question everything I thought I knew about the hospital's layout. The call came through our radio at 2:15 a.m. Unit 9. Respond to St. Matthew's Regional 4th Floor Psychiatric Wing. Room 437. Patient transfer to state facility. Priority 2. My partner Lisa and I acknowledged the call and made the familiar drive to the hospital. Interfacility transfers were routine, usually involving patients who required specialized care at the state psychiatric hospital 40 miles north. We entered through the hospital's emergency department, as required for after-hours access, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The psychiatric wing had been renovated 3 years earlier, and the floors were polished linoleum that reflected the fluorescent lighting. Security doors required staff assistance to access, but the night charge nurse usually met us at the elevator to escort us to the patient's room. When the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, we found ourselves in a corridor I didn't recognize. The walls were painted institutional green instead of the calming blue tones of the renovated wing. The flooring was older vinyl tile, scuffed and worn. The ceiling tiles showed water damage stains that I had never noticed during previous visits. Everything about the environment felt dated, as if we had stepped back in time. A nurse approached us from the direction of what should have been the main desk. She wore scrubs that looked decades old in style and carried a metal clipboard instead of the electronic tablets that staff typically used for patient records. Her name badge was missing, which violated hospital policy, but she seemed to know exactly why we were there. Room 437, she said without introduction. Patient is stable for transfer. Paperwork is complete. She handed me the clipboard with transfer orders that appeared to be handwritten rather than computer-generated. The patient's name was listed as James Morrison, age 54, diagnosed with acute psychosis. Transport authorization was signed by Dr. Catherine Walsh, a physician whose name I didn't recognize from previous transfers, Lisa, and I followed the nurse down the corridor toward room 437. The room numbers we passed seemed out of sequence compared to the renovated wing's numbering system. Rooms 401 through 412 were on the left side of the corridor, but the right side showed numbers in the 440s. The layout made no architectural sense, yet we continued following the nurse's confident lead. Room 437 was located at the end of the corridor, behind a heavy wooden door that contrasted sharply with the lightweight metal doors used throughout the rest of the hospital. The nurse produced an old-fashioned brass key to unlock the door, rather than using the electronic keycard system that secured all other rooms in the psychiatric wing. The room was empty, not empty of furniture. The standard hospital bed, monitoring equipment, and visitor chairs were all in place, but there was no patient. The bed was unmade, the sheets twisted and pulled aside as if someone had recently left in a hurry. Leather restraints hung from the bed rails, buckled tightly closed around empty air. "Where is Mr. Morrison?" I asked the nurse. She consulted the clipboard with a confused expression, as if she had expected to find the patient exactly where we were all looking. "He was here for evening medication," she replied. The restraints were ordered by Dr. Walsh for his safety. Lisa checked the bathroom and closet while I examined the restraints. They were buckled to a circumference that would have fit a medium-sized adult male, tightened to the point where removal would have been impossible without assistance. Yet they contained nothing. The leather showed wear patterns consistent with recent use, and the metal buckles were warm to the touch. I radioed our dispatcher to confirm the transport request. The response was immediate and clear. Unit 9, no transport requests have been issued for St. Matthew's Regional tonight. Your unit shows available and in quarters. When I explained our location and the transfer orders we had received, dispatch asked us to contact the hospital directly to resolve the discrepancy. The nurse who had escorted us to the room was nowhere to be found. Lisa and I walked back toward the elevator, but the corridor had changed again. The room numbers now followed a logical sequence. The walls were painted in the familiar blue tones of the renovated wing, and the flooring was the polished linoleum we expected. We were back in the psychiatric unit we knew, but room 437 no longer existed. At the main desk, the night charge nurse looked up from her computer with surprise. "Unit 9, we didn't call for any transport tonight. All of our patients are stable and accounted for." When I showed her the transfer orders on the metal clipboard, she examined the paperwork with growing confusion. "Dr. Walsh retired 8 years ago," she said. "And we don't have a room 437 in this wing." The charge nurse's computer showed that room 437 had been part of the old psychiatric wing that was destroyed in a fire 10 years earlier. 3 patients and 1 staff member had died in that fire, including a patient named James Morrison, who had been found restrained to his bed, unable to escape when smoke filled the corridor. The entire section had been demolished and rebuilt, with a new numbering system that eliminated rooms in the 430s entirely. Lisa and I completed an incident report documenting our experience, but the administration filed it as a case of miscommunication rather than investigating the details we had observed. The metal clipboard disappeared from our equipment before we returned to quarters, and neither of us could locate the transfer orders that had initially brought us to the hospital. 2 weeks later, I returned to St. Matthew's for a routine psychiatric transport. While waiting for the patient to be prepared for transfer, I asked the charge nurse about the hospital's history. She confirmed that the old psychiatric wing had been sealed after the fire, with access restricted to maintenance personnel only. The area was scheduled for complete renovation, but budget constraints had delayed the project indefinitely. She also mentioned that security cameras occasionally recorded unusual activity in the sealed sections of the hospital. Motion detectors triggering without apparent cause, elevator cars stopping at floors that were supposed to be inaccessible, and electronic locks engaging and disengaging in patterns that suggested someone was moving through the abandoned corridors. What troubles me most about that night isn't the impossibility of accessing a demolished wing or receiving transfer orders for a patient who died years ago. It's how naturally we followed the procedures, how easily we accepted the authority of a nurse with no identification, how completely the system seemed designed to guide us exactly where we needed to go. Sometimes I wonder if our emergency response protocols were written to accommodate more than living patients, and whether the hospitals we serve might be serving needs that extend beyond the boundaries of what we can officially acknowledge. The leather restraints, buckled tight around empty air, remain the most disturbing image from that night. They suggested someone had been there recently, someone who required physical restraint for their own safety. But restraints that contain nothing raise questions about the nature of the patients we're sometimes called to help, and whether our medical interventions might extend to cases that exist somewhere between treatment and remembrance. Equipment transfers between stations are routine in our emergency medical services system. When a station upgrades their supplies or closes temporarily for renovations, the surplus equipment gets redistributed to other facilities rather than being discarded. We received such a shipment on February 3rd, including 6 oxygen tanks from Station 12, which had been closed after a carbon monoxide leak in their quarters. I've learned to be suspicious of equipment that comes with no history, no maintenance records, and no explanation for why it was surplus in the first place. My partner Tom and I were tasked with inventorying the new equipment and integrating it into our standard supplies. 5 of the oxygen tanks were clearly marked with standard medical grade labels, serial numbers, and inspection dates. The 6th tank was different. No manufacturer markings, no inspection stickers, no identification numbers of any kind. It was also significantly heavier than the others, despite the pressure gauge reading completely empty. Tom suggested we set the unmarked tank aside for maintenance to examine, but our supervisor instructed us to put all equipment into immediate service. The night shift had already begun, and we needed full complement of supplies in case of multiple casualty incidents. I made a note in the equipment log about the unmarked tank's unusual characteristics, then loaded it onto our ambulance with the rest of our oxygen supply. Our first call came through at 10:30 p.m. Elderly female, difficulty breathing, possible cardiac event. Mrs. Patterson, age 78, lived alone in a ground floor apartment and had managed to call 911 when her chest pain began. We found her conscious but struggling, with obvious signs of respiratory distress and elevated heart rate. Tom prepared the cardiac monitor while I established intravenous access and initiated oxygen therapy. Mrs. Patterson's condition required high-flow oxygen, so I connected her mask to the nearest tank on our equipment rack. It happened to be the unmarked tank that had been delivered that afternoon. The moment I opened the valve, her vital signs changed dramatically. Not improved, flatlined. Complete cardiac arrest, no pulse, no respiratory effort. The patient who had been talking to us 30 seconds earlier was now clinically dead. Tom immediately began chest compressions while I switched the oxygen supply to a different tank and prepared for advanced cardiac life support. Within 2 minutes of changing the oxygen source, Mrs. Patterson's heart rhythm returned and she regained consciousness. She had no memory of the cardiac arrest. As far as she knew, we had simply placed the oxygen mask on her face and she had begun feeling better. Her vital signs stabilized completely, and she refused transport to the hospital, stating that she felt fine and wanted to remain at home. We completed our assessment, documented a refusal of medical aid, and returned to service. Back at quarters, I examined the unmarked oxygen tank more carefully. The gauge still read empty, despite having supplied oxygen for several minutes during the call. When I opened the valve without any equipment connected, I could hear gas flowing, but there was no detectable odor or sensation of air movement. Tom suggested we test the tank's contents with our gas analyzer to determine what it actually contained. The analyzer couldn't identify the gas mixture. Not oxygen, not air, not any of the standard gases used in medical applications. The electronic sensors registered the presence of some kind of gas, but displayed error codes when attempting to determine the specific composition. It was as if the tank contained something that wasn't supposed to exist in any medical supply. Catalog I documented the incident and recommended that the unmarked tank be removed from service pending investigation. The next morning, our supervisor agreed and instructed me to store it in the equipment room until it could be returned to Station 12 for evaluation. I placed it on a clearly marked shelf with a "Do Not Use" tag attached to the valve. 3 days later, the unmarked tank was back on our ambulance. Tom had no memory of loading it, and I certainly hadn't moved it from the equipment room. Yet there it was, properly secured in our oxygen rack, ready for service. I removed it again, and this time locked it in the station's maintenance closet with a written note explaining why it should not be returned to service. The tank reappeared on our ambulance the following week. No one admitted to moving it, and the maintenance closet remained locked with my note still taped to the door. But somehow the unmarked tank had migrated back to exactly where it would be most likely to be used during an emergency call. This pattern continued despite increasingly elaborate measures to keep it out of service. I began keeping detailed records of the tank's movements, documenting each time I removed it from service and each time it reappeared on our equipment. The pattern was consistent. Within 72 hours of being placed in storage, it would return to our ambulance, properly secured and ready for use. The timing suggested that something was actively monitoring our equipment and ensuring the tank remained available. We responded to 2 more calls where the unmarked tank was accidentally used. Both patients experienced the same temporary cardiac arrest that had affected Mrs. Patterson. Both recovered completely when switched to standard oxygen supplies. Both had no memory of the incident. It was as if the tank provided some kind of medical treatment that required clinical death as an intermediate step. On March 15th, I decided to test the tank under controlled conditions. With Tom monitoring and standard resuscitation equipment standing by, I opened the valve and took a single breath directly from the tank's output. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not unconsciousness exactly, but a profound separation from physical reality that lasted exactly 93 seconds by Tom's count. During those 93 seconds, I was clinically dead. No pulse, no respiratory effort, no response to physical stimuli. But I was also completely aware of everything happening around me. I could see Tom preparing the defibrillator, hear him calling my name, feel him checking for vital signs. I was experiencing death from the perspective of someone who remained conscious throughout the process. When I returned to normal physiological function, the unmarked tank's gauge had moved for the first time since we received it, still not reading full but no longer showing empty. It was as if the tank's contents were somehow replenished by whatever had happened during my temporary death. Tom insisted that we report the incident immediately, but I convinced him to give me time to understand what we had discovered. The tank disappeared from our station the following day. Not moved to storage, not transferred to another facility, simply gone. Our equipment inventory showed no record of an unmarked oxygen tank ever being assigned to our ambulance. The incident reports I had filed were missing from our administrative files, and Tom began claiming that he had no memory of any unusual equipment. But I still remember the sensation of breathing something that wasn't quite air from a tank that wasn't quite empty. And sometimes during cardiac arrest calls, I notice that my patients' expressions aren't quite unconscious. They're watching, listening, experiencing their own clinical death from the same impossible perspective I had glimpsed. It makes me wonder if the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than our medical training suggests, and whether some of our life-saving equipment might be designed to explore that boundary rather than simply restore normal function. Route 17 between our station and County General Hospital is a straight 23-mile stretch of 2-lane highway that I've driven hundreds of times over the past 11 years. I know every curve, every intersection, every landmark along that route by memory. The drive takes exactly 28 minutes during normal traffic conditions, 35 minutes during rush hour. What happened during our transport on March 29th challenged my understanding of basic geography and left me questioning whether familiar. Roads always lead to the same destinations. The call came through at 11:15 p.m. Male patient, mid-60s, chest pain and shortness of breath. Address was a rural farmhouse about 8 miles north of our station. My partner Susan and I responded with standard cardiac emergency protocols, expecting a routine transport to County General for cardiac workup and possible admission. We found Mr. Anderson sitting on his front porch, alert and oriented but clearly in distress. Pale skin, diaphoretic, complaining of crushing chest pain that had begun 2 hours earlier. His vital signs confirmed our suspicions: elevated heart rate, slightly elevated blood pressure, oxygen saturation lower than optimal. Classic presentation for myocardial infarction. Time was critical. Susan established intravenous access while I prepared the cardiac monitor and administered nitrates for chest pain relief. Mr. Anderson responded well to initial treatment, his pain level decreasing from 8 out of 10 to manageable 4 out of 10. We loaded him onto our stretcher and began immediate transport to County General's emergency department, which had an excellent cardiac catheterization laboratory. I radioed the hospital to provide advance notification. County General, Unit 14 en route with a 64-year-old male, possible STEMI. ETA 28 minutes. The emergency department acknowledged and confirmed they would have the cardiac team standing by for our arrival. Everything proceeded according to standard protocol for time-sensitive cardiac emergencies. Susan drove with lights and sirens while I continued monitoring Mr. Anderson's condition in the patient compartment. His vital signs remained stable, and he was conversational throughout the initial portion of the transport. He mentioned that he had worked as a mechanic for 40 years, had 3 grown children, and had never experienced chest pain like this before. Normal patient conversation that helps pass time during emergency transports. 20 minutes into the transport, I realized we should have been approaching the outskirts of town where County General was located. But when I looked out the rear windows of the ambulance, I saw only the same rural farmland that surrounded Mr. Anderson's home. No town lights, no change in the character of the landscape. Just endless fields stretching toward the horizon under a clear night sky. I checked my watch. 11:53 p.m. We had been driving for 38 minutes, well past our normal arrival time. I keyed the radio to check our location with Susan. How much further to County General? Her response was immediate but confused. Should be about 15 more minutes. We're making good time on Route 17. 15. More minutes would put our total transport time at over 50 minutes for a journey that had never taken longer than 35 minutes under the worst conditions. I moved to the front of the patient compartment to look through the windshield. Route 17 stretched ahead exactly as it always did, straight asphalt disappearing into darkness, centerline marking the familiar path toward the hospital, but we weren't getting any closer. The odometer showed that we had traveled 31 miles since leaving Mr. Anderson's farmhouse. Under normal circumstances, we should have arrived at County General 8 miles ago, yet the landscape remained unchanged. The road continued straight ahead, and Susan maintained highway speed with full emergency response lights and sirens activated. Mr. Anderson noticed my confusion. "Having trouble finding the hospital?" he asked quietly. When I confirmed that we seemed to be taking longer than usual, he nodded as if this were perfectly normal. "Sometimes the road doesn't want to let you reach your destination," he said, "especially when you're carrying someone who wasn't meant to be picked up." I asked what he meant by that, but Mr. Anderson had closed his eyes and appeared to be resting. His vital signs remained stable, so I focused on trying to understand our navigational situation. I radioed County General to update our estimated time of arrival, but received no response. Multiple attempts to reach the hospital resulted in static, as if we were too far away for radio communication. Susan reported the same problem with our standard radio channels. No contact with dispatch. No response from other emergency services. Just empty frequencies where we should have been receiving routine traffic. Our GPS unit showed our location as a blank screen, unable to acquire satellite positioning despite the clear sky above us. At 12:30 a.m., after driving for 75 minutes on a route that should have taken 28 minutes, the road began to change. Not the physical asphalt or lane markings, but the landscape around us. The same farmland, the same fence posts, the same rural mailboxes we had passed at the beginning of our journey. We were somehow driving in a circle despite maintaining a straight heading on a road that had no curves. Mr. Anderson opened his eyes and looked directly at me. "You can stop trying to get to the hospital now," he said calmly. "I'm not having a heart attack." When I checked his cardiac monitor, the abnormal rhythm that had been present throughout the transport had resolved to normal sinus rhythm. His chest pain was completely gone, his skin color had returned to normal, and his oxygen saturation was perfect. The patient who had required emergency cardiac intervention an hour earlier was now showing no signs of medical distress whatsoever. It was as if the extended transport had somehow cured whatever condition had prompted the original 911 call. Susan confirmed from the driver's seat that she could see the lights of County General ahead of us, exactly where they should have been after a normal 28-minute drive. We arrived at the hospital at 12:47 a.m., 92 minutes after beginning a transport that should have taken less than 30 minutes. The emergency department staff was surprised to see us, mentioning that they had been expecting our arrival over an hour earlier. When they asked about the delay, Susan and I exchanged glances but provided no explanation beyond traffic complications. Mr. Anderson's cardiac workup at the hospital was completely normal. EKG showed no signs of heart attack, blood work revealed no cardiac enzyme elevation, and his chest X-ray was clear. The emergency physician discharged him with instructions to follow up with his primary care doctor and to call 911 if symptoms returned. He shook my hand before leaving and said quietly, "Thank you for the ride." All of it. Our trip report documented a routine cardiac transport with extended travel time due to road conditions. The odometer reading showed that we had driven 67 miles during the transport, but both Susan and I agreed to record the standard 23-mile distance to avoid administrative questions about our navigation methods. I've driven Route 17 dozens of times since that night, and it always takes exactly 28 minutes under normal conditions. The road leads directly to County General Hospital, just as it has for the 11 years I've been making that trip. But sometimes, late at night when I'm transporting patients who seem unusually calm about their medical emergencies, I notice that the odometer climbs higher than it should, and the familiar landmarks take longer to appear than expected. What disturbs me most isn't the impossibility of driving 67 miles on a 23-mile road, but Mr. Anderson's suggestion that some patients aren't meant to be picked up. It implies that our emergency medical system occasionally responds to calls that exist outside normal parameters, transporting people who require something other than standard medical intervention. Sometimes I wonder if the extended journey itself was the treatment, and whether some of our ambulances might be equipped to travel distances that can't be measured by conventional odometers. Partner assignments in emergency medical services follow strict protocols designed to ensure crew safety and operational efficiency. We never work alone, never respond to calls without backup, and never separate during emergency calls except under carefully controlled circumstances. These protocols exist because the nature of our work exposes us to unpredictable situations where immediate assistance can mean the difference between life and death. What happened during the call on April 14th violated every safety protocol I had learned in 10 years of service. Yet it occurred so naturally that I didn't realize the impossibility until hours later. My partner Kevin and I were assigned to Unit 11 for the overnight shift, scheduled from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Kevin had been working emergency medical services for 8 years, and we had been partnered for 6 months. Professional relationship, reliable teamwork, the kind of partnership that develops when two people learn to anticipate each other's actions during high-stress situations. I trusted him completely, which made his disappearance all the more unsettling. The call came through at 2:45 a.m. Elderly male, unresponsive, possible cardiac arrest. Address was a single-story house on Elm Street, a residential neighborhood where we had responded to medical calls before. Kevin acknowledged the dispatch while I checked our equipment and prepared for possible resuscitation efforts. Standard protocol for a potentially critical emergency. We arrived at 127 Elm Street within 6 minutes of dispatch. The house was dark except for a single light in what appeared to be the front bedroom. No cars in the driveway, no signs of other family members or bystanders. Kevin parked the ambulance in front of the house while I gathered the cardiac monitor and resuscitation bag from our equipment compartment. "I'll check on the patient," Kevin said, taking the portable radio and medical bag. "You bring the monitor and prepare for possible transport." This was standard procedure. One partner makes initial patient contact while the other organizes equipment and coordinates with dispatch. Kevin approached the front door while I arranged our stretcher and checked the oxygen supplies. The front door was unlocked. Kevin entered the house and radioed back immediately. "Patient is in the bedroom, checking vitals now." I confirmed his transmission and continued preparing equipment. Emergency calls in elderly patients often require extensive cardiac support, so I wanted everything ready for immediate deployment once Kevin completed his initial assessment. 5 minutes passed without further radio contact. I called Kevin's portable radio. "Unit 11, what's your status?" No response. I repeated the call twice, then switched to the direct channel we used for partner-to-partner communication. Still no response. After 10 minutes of radio silence, I decided to enter the house to check on Kevin's status. The front door remained open exactly as Kevin had left it. I called his name as I entered, following the hallway toward the bedroom where the light was still burning. The house was completely silent. No voices, no movement, no sounds of medical intervention. I found the bedroom where Kevin should have been assessing the patient. The room was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No furniture, no medical equipment, no signs that anyone had been in the room recently. The light Kevin and I had seen from outside was a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, illuminating a space that contained nothing but dust patterns on hardwood floors. No patient, no Kevin, no indication that a medical emergency had ever occurred. I searched the entire house methodically, calling Kevin's name and checking every room, closet, and basement area. The house was vacant, showing signs of being unoccupied for an extended period. No utilities except electricity, no personal belongings, no evidence that anyone lived there. Yet our dispatch had directed us to this address for a medical emergency, and Kevin had radioed confirmation of patient contact. I returned to the ambulance and radioed dispatch for assistance. Unit 11 requesting supervisor and backup unit at 127 Elm Street. Partner missing. No patient found at location. The dispatcher's response was immediate but confusing. Unit 11, please clarify your request. Your unit shows single-person staffing for tonight's shift. Single-person staffing violated every protocol in our service area. No ambulance operates with only one crew member, and Unit 11 was specifically assigned two-person staffing for all overnight shifts. I repeated my request for assistance, explaining that my partner Kevin had entered the house 20 minutes earlier and failed to respond to radio contact dispatch. Consulted their staffing records and confirmed that Unit 11 was assigned only one crew member for April 14th, myself. No record of Kevin being scheduled for that shift. No documentation of two-person staffing. No acknowledgement that I had ever worked with a partner named Kevin. According to official records, I had responded to 127 Elm Street alone. Supervisor Williams arrived 15 minutes later, followed by Unit 7 as backup. Williams reviewed the situation and checked the house himself, confirming that it was vacant and showed no signs of recent occupancy. When I described Kevin's radio transmissions and initial patient contact, Williams consulted his personnel roster. No employee named Kevin in our service area, no record of anyone matching his description. The crew from Unit 7, Jake and Maria, both claimed they had never seen me working with a partner. According to their recollection, I had always been assigned to single-person units and had never mentioned working with anyone named Kevin. When I described Kevin's physical appearance and experience level, neither of them could identify who I might be referring to. We returned to quarters at 4:30 a.m. after completing incident reports documenting a false alarm call to a vacant house. I was removed from service pending a fitness for duty evaluation, standard procedure, when a crew member reports experiences that contradict official records. The evaluation was scheduled for the following week. Before leaving the station, I checked the shift logbook where all crew members sign in and out for their assigned shifts. My signature was present for April 14th, documenting my assignment to Unit 11. Directly below my signature was another entry. Kevin Walsh, EMT Paramedic, Unit 11, 2200-0600. The handwriting was unmistakably Kevin's. Distinctive signature that I had seen dozens of times on patient care. Reports. I photographed the logbook entry with my phone before anyone else could see it, but when I returned to show Supervisor Williams, the page showed only my signature. Kevin's entry had disappeared, leaving blank space where his name and credentials had been documented just minutes earlier. The photographic evidence on my phone showed only my own signature, as if Kevin's entry had never existed. The fitness for duty evaluation concluded that I had experienced a stress-related incident resulting in false memories of working with a non-existent partner. Recommended treatment included counseling and temporary assignment to day shift duties where supervisor oversight would be more readily available. I was cleared to return to work with the understanding that any similar incidents would result in permanent removal from emergency services. I accepted the day shift assignment and never mentioned Kevin, again to my supervisors or colleagues. But I kept copies of every patient care report we had completed together over 6 months of partnership. Dozens of documents bearing both of our signatures, both of our credential numbers, both of our assessments and treatment decisions. Physical evidence that Kevin Walsh had been my partner, had responded to emergency calls, had provided patient care that was documented and filed in official medical records. 3 months later, I received a phone call at home from someone claiming to be Kevin. The voice was unmistakably his, calling to thank me for not revealing what had happened at 127 Elm Street. Some calls require only one person to respond, he said. The system adjusts accordingly. When I asked where he was calling from, he replied, "I'm still on duty, Michael. I just work different shifts now. What haunts me most isn't the impossibility of a partner who existed for 6 months and then vanished from all records. It's the systematic way every trace of his existence was removed, except for my memories and the patient care he provided. It suggests that our emergency response system can accommodate personnel who exist outside normal employment records, creating partnerships that serve purposes beyond what can be officially acknowledged. Sometimes I wonder if some calls require assistance from sources that can't be documented in standard personnel files, and whether our most reliable partners might be those who appear exactly when needed and disappear exactly when their service is complete.